Okay, we're going to start looking at some of the various power tools that you'll use in the trade. The first one that we'll look at is called an impact gun. So I have here a 1/2-inch drive impact gun. It has a spring clip mechanism in it. A lot of times they're either going to have so that it has a spring clip here, and a lot of times they're actually going to have a detent, or on some of the larger ones there's actually a through hole where you can slide a keeper pin in it. So these are impact sockets. This is a deep impact socket. So this is for tightening a nut that is on a threaded rod, where you maybe need a little bit more room to remove the fastener. I have this hooked up to a air line here with my air fittings. Now, a lot of times, instead of this just being connected right into the impact gun, you would actually have a whip line that would come off of here that you can connect. It's a little bit more flexible. Instead of having the fitting connected right into the gun, it just makes it a little bit more flexible. So it's just an air quick connect. We have our gun. There's 2 settings here on this one. So you slide the forward and it goes in the forward direction. You turn this the other way and it's gonna reverse it. So a lot of times they have rubber guards on them. They're pretty robust. You can adjust the amount of torque that they put out with this screw here at the bottom. So if you want it to be less torque, you can thread this out. If you want it to be more torque, you can thread this in. The exhaust is going to come out of the front of this gun. And so these guns can get abused a lot in industry. A lot of people won't maintain it. They'll throw it back in the tool crib. But it is a good idea when you pick this up to put a few drops of light pneumatic air tool oil inside of the air intake here, and that way when you go to use it, all the parts in the mechanism inside of here will all get lubricated properly. One other point is these impact sockets work with these impact guns. The reason they're called an impact gun, if I'll demonstrate here, they actually hammer when they work. I'll just show you here that they have an impacting mechanism inside of them that adds the torque to the fastener. Now, if you were to do that with one of these sockets, you run the risk of breaking it. So if you look at the wall thickness on these regular sockets versus the wall thickness on the impact gun, as well as the plating. So the plating can chip off and break, and these can crack, whereas these impact guns are a lot stronger, and the aluminum oxide finish on it or gunmetal finish on it, it will protect it, but it won't, it's not as nice and pretty. So those are all the things about an air impact gun. These guns come in electric format with a battery. It can be a cord. This is an air, and yeah, those are all the different types that you can get. Okay, so let's look at some of the drills that you'll be using. We'll start with some of the lighter duty drills. So anything that has a chuck. And look at this drill. You see that the chuck, this one actually opens, I think, to 1/2 inch, but anything that is a 1/4 inch in shank size, that'll accept a 1/4 inch or 3/8 shank, a drill bit will be considered light duty. Anything that's 1/2 inch and higher would be light duty, but I consider these little battery powered 18 volt to be quite light duty, although they are convenient because you don't have to run extension cords to use them when you're working in distant corners of the facility. So these have a quick chuck, so there's no chuck key. So it just, when you put the drill bit in and then you hold it, you can actually tighten the drill bit, tighten it up on the drill bit, and then just crank it by hand to tighten it. And that will give you somewhat of a secure hold. A more secure method of grabbing the drill bit would be with a keyed chuck. So this is a drill bit with a keyed chuck. I can tighten this up by turning this outer sleeve here. And when you get to the point where you want to tighten it up, you have these chuck keys. This one is attached to the cord of this drill. And so the chuck key goes right inside of the there's 3 holes on here, and then you just turn that, and that gives you a little bit more mechanical advantage, a little bit more than the keyless chuck where you just grab it by hand. Now, one thing that I've been taught over the years is that when you use these keyed chucks, whether it's on one of the drill presses behind me or on a hand drill, is to take a second and tighten up all 3 of the holes. So you go to one, then go to the next one, and then go to the next one. That will make sure there's a kind of a spiral gear in there, so that'll make sure that it's all tightened up evenly, and so the drill bit would be less likely to be pushed to the side, and it'll just give it a good solid grab. Not necessary, but good practice. Next we have what we would consider a heavy duty drill. So this drill here is Makita, and it accepts a 1/2 inch. So it has a 1/2 inch chuck. The chuck can accept that size. It is, or 13 millimeters. And so this is a slower RPM drill. This drill will not drill as fast of an RPM as this smaller Makita will, but it does have a lot more torque. So if you have a apprentice drill or a larger size drill bit in here and you start drilling, you can hold the trigger, and then you can hold this opposite handle to give you a little bit more torque in case the drill bit bites and it wants to kick on you. So it gives you a little bit more stability than the just traditional kind of standard pistol grip with a side handle on it. One final type of drill that I'll kind of cover is called the hilt. This is the brand Hilti. Hilti is one of the major manufacturers of this type of drill, but this is a what we call a rotary hammer or a hammer drill. So this one will not only jackhammer, but it'll receive what's called an SDS bit, which is a carbide tip that I'll pull out in a second. And so as this rotates, it actually has a mechanism that jackhammers at the same time. So these are used to core holes, drill holes into concrete, and to drop steel fasteners, drop in anchors, or just drill through any kind of masonry. This is what one of the hammer drill bits will look like. So this is an SDS bit. So you see there is 2 keyways, and then on each side, so that's the longer groove here. And then there's 2 detent channels where there's spring-loaded balls inside of this that will actually kind of lock in and hold it in place. So this is driven with the keys. The key is what actually turns it, and then the detents are what hold it from falling out. So to put this in, you just pull the chuck back and then lock it in, and it just slides in just that easy. If you're having a hard time getting it to line up, it usually just means you just have to turn the bit 90 degrees and it'll just lock into place. And yeah, this has a setting on it where you can loosen off the handle. You can adjust the handle anywhere that's convenient for you, left or right-handed. Turn the grip to hold it to tighten it up. And then on the other side here, you can see that it has different functions. So you have a hammer drilling function. You have a straight drilling function, so we can just drill regularly. You can drill and hammer. And then on the top here, we have a setting for just jackhammering. So there are bits that can go in these drills that are just like a spike that you can just use, or a chisel as just for jackhammering away chunks of concrete. You can see in the end here, there is some carbide inserts. So you want to make sure that those are in good shape and they're not missing, not cracked. And there's one other feature of this drill, which is not currently in there. I don't have one in the box, but it is a depth gauge. So you can put a rod, if you're in a pinch, get a welding rod or something and put it in here, and then you can set that for the length. So when you're drilling, if you just want to drill, say like a 6-inch hole, you can have that kind of as a stop. So when you drill, you reach that certain point, and then that rod would hit and kind of set your depth of hole. Okay, so now we're in the welding shop. The next power tool that I want to talk about is a big one for our trade with the amount of metal working that we do. So this is a 5-inch Makita angle grinder. It has a handle which can be removed and threaded into either side depending on what hand you are. This is what's comfortable for me. It's 5 inches because it has the capacity to you have the capacity to mount a 5-inch wheel on here. The guard can be rotated and turned depending on what type of grinding or cutting that you are doing with this. The guard must be tight. Like this one is quite loose. I'm able to just move it freely. You definitely would want to have it a little bit tighter than that. You can adjust the guard here with a screwdriver and to whatever. If you're grinding like this would be a good position. You can just come down and grind that way, or if you're going to be cutting or doing something, then you can turn it to the side so that you can use it this way. These are very robust. You want to make sure that the cord is in good repair. A lot of times these get hung by the cords or misused, hung off of a cart or something like that. So make sure it's in good repair. You have a switch here that clicks in, and then you have a secondary notch that will hold that in. That's for when you're doing long grinding and you don't want to necessarily tire out your hand by holding that on there. So you can turn that on, get it started, and then start the grinding process. Hit the trigger again to release and stop the grinding wheel. When you go to mount the blade, it's important to make sure and note that the blade, or the grinding wheel that you're going to be installing, is rated for the proper RPM for the grinding angle grinder that you have. The other main size that you have to think about is the arbor. So this arbor is a 5/8 arbor. You can also find them in metric. Some of them are 12 mil arbors. So the nut isn't universal amongst all grinders. Something that might get you from time to time. When you go to release or change the wheel on here, there is a button that is a lock on the wheel. So now it won't turn. And then I can take my spanner wrench and I can put it inside of those holes on the nut on the arbor, and I can loosen it off. And it's just a standard right-hand thread. When I take this off, you can see that there is a shoulder on the nut that fits right inside of this steel collar that houses the wheel. So when I go to tighten that up, again, I'm going to hold the lock in and I'll grab my spanner, and I can either tighten this by hand or I can grab the spanner and tighten it up. If you do end up needing to put a zip cut disc on, if I take this off, okay, and if I want to mount a zip cut blade, I need to make sure, first of all, that I have my backing ring on. And then this is a zip cut blade. So zip cut blades are used specifically only for cutting on the cutting edge. They're not designed for grinding. You never take a zip cut blade and use it like a grinding wheel and grind material off. It's just for using against, perpendicular to the axis of the arbor of the grinding wheel. So you just want to use the edge. When you mount a grinding or a zip cut on here, you want to not use that shoulder that I talked about. You don't want to put that in there and try and tighten it down, because it won't tighten up for you. What you need to do is you need to use the other side, the flat part, and that will thread in on the arbor for this grinding wheel. Now, when you go to tighten that up, again, you can hold the locking button, but with a zip cut, because they're so thin and so fragile, you don't want to use a wrench. You don't want to tighten it with a wrench. Instead, what you do is just by hand, while this is unplugged, just give it a little bit of a tight by hand. Now, that'll stay tight because the direction of rotation and the friction that you have inside between the nut and the disc will actually spin against. The wheel wants to go in one direction, and it's going to actually tighten that nut for you based on the friction between the wheel and the nut. So you don't have to worry too much about that, as long as it's snug and it's not just freewheeling, free spinning off of it. Okay, so those are all the things about angle grinders. You can see behind me, regularly shops, what they'll do is they'll set up an angle grinder. So one would be a zip cut, one would be a wire wheel, one would be maybe for polishing, and then there'd be like grinding wheel or something like that on it. Making sure that you have the proper abrasive wheel for whatever process that you need to do. The next tool we'll look at is this behind me. This is a contour bandsaw, also known as a vertical bandsaw. So let's start by looking at some of the main parts. So the main parts are the head. So in the top there is a pulley, that's the upper pulley. Then you have the table. So the table is where you place the work when you're running it through the saw blade. So this orange piece is the blade guide, and you can see that the blade is there as well. Other things that you can adjust the speed. If you look down at the bottom here, there is a speed adjusting pulley. So it's a variable speed drive, so you're actually kind of changing the size of the drive pulleys to get the speed that you require. Here on the frame is a welding machine. So these blades are actually kind of cut from a roll of material and can be welded. That's two reasons for that. One, if the blade breaks, you can fix it. You can cut out sections and fix it. The other reason for that is if you want to cut out a centerpiece out of a hole, you can actually drill a hole in the material, run the bandsaw blade through the table, weld it with the blade going through the workpiece, mount the blade with the piece on the table, and then you can do individual cuts on this contour bandsaw. Okay, so this adjusting blade guide here is you pull down on lock on this, then you can move this guy up and down depending on how thick the material is. Now this can cut a very large piece of steel or stock. It can also be lowered to cut some thin sheet metal. So on this particular bandsaw, you end up fighting this guard a little bit. So sometimes you have to come and get it to the height you want, lock it, and then close this guard after the fact. So we're gonna try to cut a thinner piece of metal. So I'll set it there, lock this in position, and then close that up. So I hope you can see here, but you see how the guide blocks are the full width of this blade. So this blade looks like a 1/2-inch blade, and then these guides are the full length minus the teeth that are sticking out. So when I go to cut my piece of steel or my piece of stock, what I would need to do is set the height to the right height here. So I'm underneath the guide blocks, but I'm actually going to be hitting the guide that is in the way there. So I need to raise this guard up a little bit. Now you can see that I can travel underneath. Now I want to have that nice down and low, close to the workpiece as I can. So when I start up the saw, I'm keeping my hands away from the saw, and I'm going to start it up, and I'm going to start feeding it through. Okay, the next cutoff saw, we talked about the contour bandsaw, but this is a abrasive cutoff saw. So this is a large abrasive, like a large zip cut abrasive wheel on here. And these saws are really good for stock material that's kind of a smaller cross-sectional size. Something like this. Now you can see here when this was being cut, it produces a very nice square finish if you take the time to square up the fence and clamp the material in there. But you do end up with this kind of melted edge on here that's very sharp and needs to be ground down or kind of cleaned up after the fact. But yeah, these grinders or these cutters are very, very good.